Good morning, everyone. I'm Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. Welcome to our joint panel that we're co-hosting with the RAND Corporation on revisiting U.S. strategy in the Middle East and North Africa region. Next week, we mark the first 100 days in office for the Biden administration. So this discussion is very timely to assess U.S. foreign policy's approach to the region and whether the Biden administration is listening to the experts on this issue. Is it much of the same that we've seen traditionally under Democratic administrations? And how will this policy evolve further? Our experts today will compare ideas and approaches and explore new policy directions for the MENA region, which sadly remains to house various lingering conflicts and continues to see very serious challenges to human development. But before we turn to our panel of experts, I'd like to introduce and invite Linda Robinson to say a few words. Linda is a former public policy fellow with the Wilson Center and currently director of the RAND Center for Middle East Public Policy. Linda.
Thank you, Marissa. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to thank the Wilson Center, Marissa, Jim Jeffrey, for inviting me to co-sponsor this event. RAND's study, Reimagining U.S. Strategy in the Middle East, was motivated by various inflection points, including, of course, the new administration, dislodging the ISIS caliphate, and the beginning of some drawdown of forces in the region. Our stock taking is based on a deep dive into the data, which suggests that we really haven't received the return on investment of our many types of resources over the years. The region's not demonstrably more stable, and we've been preoccupied with what we call threatism. And we failed really to focus on the long-term strategic issues that will determine the region's future, to include population needs, the highest unemployment of youth in the world, and critical issues like climate change, which of course the Middle East is on the leading edge of. So I want to acknowledge we have fantastic work by colleagues at CNAS and Carnegie, and of course my dear friend and colleague Dahlia, who's going to speak about the report in great detail. But I want to thank you again and turn it back to you, Marissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. And now to introduce our Middle East experts for this panel, Dahlia Daskay, who's currently a Wilson Fellow and a former director of the RAND Center for Middle East Public Policy, Michelle Dunn, director and senior fellow of the Middle East Center at Carnegie, and Ilan Goldenberg, senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Center at the Center for New American Security. So another long-term Middle East expert who now chairs our Middle East program here at the Wilson Center, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, will moderate the discussion and also weigh in with his own expertise. Before I hand it over to you, Jim, just a reminder to all of you listening and watching to submit your questions on Twitter to @WilsonCenter MEP or via email to mep@wilsoncenter.org. Jim, the Zoom floor is yours.
RAND partnering with us. Let me begin to follow up with what Linda said. I focus obviously on the Middle East, but I pay pretty close attention to what's going on in the other two major sub-elements of Eurasia, Europe and East Asia. It's fascinating how much not only think tanks, but also this administration, if you include Afghanistan and the Middle East, which I think you should, is focused on this region almost obsessively, just like prior administrations. And one of the things we'll try to do today is to figure out why, and perhaps how we can focus either less on it or more profitably on it. The region does not have a near-peer competitor, unlike Europe or the East Asia. Secondly, it doesn't have the same trade relationships that we have with Europe or East Asia or even North and South America. Thirdly, we do not have, again, the same relatively calm partnership relationships. We have problems right now with all four of our closest partners and stationing countries for US troops: Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. So One explanation is a whole series of failures. A failure to move the Palestinian-Israeli complex on after 2000, failure to stop Osama bin Laden, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Arab Spring, and the disasters that we contributed to following that in both Syria and Libya. So let's hear our experts now and figure out how they're going to get us out of this mess. Thank you very much.
Jim?
Yeah, go ahead, Dahlia.
Okay, yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I wasn't sure if I was, if the floor was being handed to me, the Zoom floor. Well, thank you so much, Marissa and Linda, one of my co-authors, of course, on the RAND study, Jim, for the introduction, and of course, to my colleagues on this panel. I'm really looking forward to comparing notes and with what other research institutions are doing, because as Jim said, I mean, this is a time, and Linda outlined the need to step back and understand how we deal with this region. We know the results have not been good for the region or for US interest. And so our study really tried to step back and look at deeper held assumptions and, looking at what results have we gotten, and basically coming to the conclusion that we can't continue to do business as usual. So as Linda noted, the framing of the study is suggesting, can we get beyond what we call the threatism focus, the threats of the day, which of course are always imperative, and we need to be dealing and managing those, and we deal with that in the study. But the idea of the study was to ask the question, not just what we're against in this region, but what are we for? What's our vision? Where would we like to get in the long term? And then what would be the set of policies that would move us closer to that direction? So our approach, getting to the issues Linda outlined that are facing this region and the world really in the 21st century, these problems without borders, our focus in our approach of this study is on people and the socioeconomic challenges, which we think are really the fundamental cause and driver of the instability we're seeing in this region, making this region one of the most conflict-prone regions of the world, second only to Africa, especially when you do deal with non-state conflicts, and sometimes surpassing Africa. So we've really got a lot of work to do. What we argue is that our long-term objective needs to be to bolster stability, but our notion of stability is not going back to kind of the conventional views of let's keep the strong men, and they usually are men in power, and kind of turn a blind eye to everything else going on within those borders. We need to be thinking about the drivers of conflicts, what is creating the instability, and what is driving the instability and kind of creating the same cycles over and over again. And that means dealing seriously with these socioeconomic and governance issues. What we do then is we take a really hard look. The study deals with partner relationships. It deals with adversarial relationships, the tools of US foreign policy, how we manage and look at our great power competitors. But what we argue, what we see through the data, is that we have had over time this incredibly heavy investment in military instruments of power. And I'm just going to, and that is matched with this, what we call legacy thinking, where these military investments and they far outpace our economic and diplomatic investments. We argue this is based on legacy thinking, based on aid packages and assistance that are really designed for a different strategic moment. Let me just give a couple examples to give you a flavor of the report. I hope you all will read it. There's a lot of information and data in there, but I'm just trying to give you the headlines right now so we can kind of start this discussion going. If you look at military aid to Egypt as an example, the amount of military aid we give to Egypt in 1 year annually, military aid is approximately the same amount of economic assistance we give to the entire region. So just think about that. The entire Middle East, conflict-ridden Middle East, is getting the same amount of economic assistance as Egypt gets in 1 year in military aid. Moreover, you have a very concentrated set of partners, what we call the big three, Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. getting 81% of all of the military assistance we give to the region. And much of that military assistance is focused on high-priced armaments, jet fighters, tanks, not necessarily the kind of military assistance that would meet the security needs of our partners in today's types of conflicts. So again, this is all part of this legacy thinking, legacy types of arrangements that we think, it doesn't mean these partners aren't still important, but we need to, this is why we talk about reimagining and rethinking. We need to go back to basics. What were they designed for, and does that still make sense? We also note that the disproportionate amount of our arms sales to the region are channeled to two partners in particular, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Just as an example, from 2015 to 2017, we sold $27 billion in arms to the Saudis and $16 billion to the UAE. They eclipse even our other Arab Gulf partners, let alone the rest of the region. So this is just some examples of the imbalance. We also find the imbalance globally. If you look at our global foreign assistance, we see that over 50%, if you combine US security assistance with arms sales, over 50% of our global assistance in these areas go to the Middle East. And it's a big world out there. We find alongside that less than 6% of our global economic assistance and development aid globally goes to the Middle East. Look at that disconnect. These are the kind of issues we really think the administration needs to take a hard look at. So far, early indications are the administration is interested in increasing the budget for the State Department, but based on preliminary outlines of the budget that we know of now, it looks like military aid is still going to be 10 times greater than anything we give to the State Department. We don't know what that balance is going to look like in the Middle East, but our report suggests that we need to be thinking about whether we rebalance some of these numbers. And then finally, for all the talk of the US leaving the Middle East, pivot to Asia, Middle East doesn't matter anymore. Well, we still have close to 50,000 forces still present in the region, excluding Afghanistan. So we still have seriously heavy investments in this region. We need to rethink, do these force postures make sense? Not with, coming in with preordained assumptions about predominance, or we need to restrain, or we need to contain or deter, but we need to look at what are we trying to achieve. That's what strategy is about. What is our strategic objective and how can we get there? And does our force presence, does our security assistance, does our engagement with this region match the moment? And we are arguing it really does not. So we conclude with recommendations suggesting we need a new set of policies that reset the balance, that match the moment we're in, not the moment we were in 40 years ago, and that also meet the needs of the new geostrategic competition underway in the world. So it really rests on three pillars. We argue for the need. First pillar is the need to, as I said, rebalance from the military to the non-military to the non-security assistance. Focus more on investing in people in this region. I think Carnegie just came out with a report along these lines, so I look forward to hearing from Michelle. We need to do much more, not just focusing on our relationships with leaders, but our relationships with people in this region, and take the people in this region seriously and deal with those underlying sources of conflict and instability that fuel the problems, the extremism, the arms proliferation, all of those things that are harmful to the region, but also harmful to us here at home. The second pillar is arguing to take a longer term approach, even if it comes at the expense of some short-term gain. We need to be thinking about long-term investments in the region's prosperity, economic development, and reduce conflict. That means, again, a different set of investments. And finally, the third pillar is multilateralism, which is recognizing that the US is no longer the only, or maybe it never was, but we no longer can be the predominant power in this region. We don't have the bandwidth anymore. It's just not the world we're living in today. This is a different strategic moment. We need to work with partners globally and regionally. We argue for not just dealing as we are with the immediate issues of like the Iran nuclear challenge with our global partners, but we need to build on those multilateral forms for cooperation to create other regional cooperation initiatives. And in particular, we do think it's time to take seriously the notion of creating a regional security architecture more or less designed along the lines of an OSCE for the Middle East, because it's not just nuclear problems in this region. We have all of these problems without borders, climate change, pandemics, counter narcotics, of course, terrorism. And these are issues that you need a regional forum to deal with. The Middle East is an outlier. It's one of the only regions in the world that doesn't have all the parties sitting at the table discussing. It doesn't mean you're going to solve these problems. This is a long-term endeavor, but you can start building confidence. You can start exchanging views. You can start getting to reducing the conflict in this region that has been so tragic and harmful. So I hope those are just kind of the major headlines of where our study is going. It's called, this is what it looks like, Reimagining the Middle East, Reimagining US Strategy in the Middle East. And we hope it starts a conversation. We know none of this is going to happen overnight, but we think this is the moment to start that conversation. Thanks.
Dalia, thank you very much. That was concise, it was to the point, and I think that the issues you raised, particularly the underlying, if you will, sources of instability, is something we can all agree on. What we deal with it is what we're going to discuss in more detail around the room. Let's go to Ilan.
Sure. Thank you, Jim. And thanks the Wilson Center and RAND for having me. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about, well, I'm going to respond to Dalia's study and also talk a little bit about something we've been doing at CNAS, a project we've been working on, we call demilitarizing US foreign policy in the Middle East. And I'll actually say, I'll start from a position of, we came at this from a very different angle than the RAND study, in that we started from a very negative, as opposed to what I heard was like sort of like a positive, like how do we reimagine, how do we think? Our very negative sort of assessment was, we're way too invested in the region. We need to sort of be pulling back. We've been trying to do that for 20 years. I mean, even if we go all the way back to George Bush, right? In 2000, he ran on not being, the world's policeman and pulling out. Very famous sort of Condoleezza Rice article in Foreign Affairs. 9/11 happens and we're deep in the Middle East, right? Barack Obama campaigned on leaving Iraq. We pull all the way out of Iraq, ISIS pops up, and in the last 2 years, there's more like deputies and principals committee meetings at the White House on Iraq than any other issue by far, on Iraq and Syria, which, as folks know, senior leader time and attention might be the single most valuable resource that you have in the US government. And then Donald Trump comes in, again, arguing for withdrawal. But in the last couple of years, we have this very significant escalation with Iran that again draws us back into the region after this argument about, a national defense strategy that was supposed to move us to Asia, just as Barack Obama was pivoting us to Asia. And so we do this time and time again. So we started from the what do we actually do? And actually, when we pulled back to that question and then started coming to conclusions, we actually had huge amounts of overlap with the RAND study. And so, our assessment was, look, from a narrow US interest perspective, what do we care about in the Middle East? We care about most counterterrorism. We care about not having attacks on US soil or attacks on American partners, right? We care about the spread of nuclear weapons, right? And that means Iran, but it also means potentially other countries, in the region responding with nuclear weapons. We care probably also about freedom of navigation. I think that is a critical interest, although I'd argue it's less about oil than it used to be. The oil markets, I mean, look, we had, missile attacks by Iran on Saudi Arabia's probably single most important oil facility in 2019, and oil prices barely moved. And so is that really what justifies our presence? I actually think to some extent that we do need to care about, the movement of resources from Europe to Asia, through the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb actually maybe being much more significant for global commerce. But oil matters less. And look, Israel is a strong partner and ally, but also frankly, much more capable of defending itself these days than it necessarily used to be. So is that the justification for our heavy military investment in the region? I don't think it should be. So if you look at really terrorism and nuclear weapons is maybe the two most important things. What spawns that challenge? And our assessment was, it's two things. One, it's the civil wars in the region, right? And this, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, these places become sort of vacuums into which, extremism can come from, all kinds of negative things can come from, mass migration that also has huge destabilizing political effects in Europe and the United States. And what are those wars caused by? Like, one, it's the governance challenges that Dalia outlined, which sort of start the wars. And two, it's intense state-on-state competition where, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, Turkey, Qatar, they all both from a defensive position see this fighting starting and these protests starting and jump in to defend their interests for fear of losing influence. And also some of it's offensive for sure. Like, hey, here's an opportunity for us to expand our influence. And what they do is they all dump weapons and money into these conflicts and turn these small little regional conflict or internal civil wars into major regional proxy wars that are deeply destabilizing. And there's a lot of academic literature on the impact of external intervention on civil wars and how it sort of fuels these and is one of the key drivers of fueling and making these civil wars more ugly. And so what we, the US, should be doing in a world like that, if this is the problem, is trying to de-escalate and end these conflicts. But we've actually done over the last 20 years, time and time again, is escalate, take a side. And instead of trying to reduce the conflicts, we've just been another player in it, whether it's triggering things in Iraq with our invasion, whether it's in Syria, arming the opposition just enough to drag this war out for years without ever actually intervening in a way that would, decisively make a difference. Whether it's in Libya, where we intervened and instead of getting mired in years of conflict, just pulled right out afterwards. In every one of these cases, we find a way to make things worse. And so what we argue for is an alternative approach that doesn't do that. And I think it sort of comes with three central components. One is, if the objective is to de-escalate conflict overall, and the problem is the conflicts, like, pursue a diplomatic strategy that actually does that, as opposed to trying to win, take one side or the other, get the geopolitical advantage. It's about ending the wars themselves. So that can be a number of different things. I think, we make the case for de-escalating with Iran, either by starting with a return to the JCPOA or some other alternative agreement. It doesn't matter that much to me, like what that looks like, other than like we need to sort of put the nuclear problem in a box because that's a big issue, and then start working on de-escalating challenges in the region, which is going to take a long time. It could be, I think eventually it would be great to get to a place like the OSCE. Our work kind of makes the case that it's going to take years to get there. And can we start just with like more limited de-escalatory deals where you can find them, right? Like, you have the Saudis now talking to the Iranians. It sounds like the Emiratis are certainly open to doing that. We should be encouraging these things. We should be looking for things like, hey, maybe if you stop supporting internal groups inside of Iran, like the MEK, you stop supporting, for example, things in Bahrain and Eastern Saudi Arabia. Like, maybe we can start there before we solve Syria. Maybe we can do things like naval de-escalation. I mean, we've also got this problem as we talk about freedom of navigation, where now you have escalation in the Red Sea, right? Both with Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also like Israel now blowing up a bunch of shipping in the Red Sea, Iranian ships. So can you look for ways to de-escalate? Can part of this also be leveraging the Abraham Accords and normalization agreements to reduce tensions, or find even defensive ways? If Israel could help Saudi Arabia and the UAE figure out how to be more effective in countering UAVs and low-range rockets, this is one thing Israel's been able to do very effectively. And because they've been able to do it against Hezbollah and against Hamas, it's also given them a lot more space to not have to respond as aggressively. So can you find ways to, share in that way and protect populations? A second, but that's all sort of under this broader diplomatic umbrella. A second piece being, yes, rethinking our assistance with I won't spend too much time on it because it's such a centerpiece of the RAND case report, but moving the mix over. And then the one thing I'd also say is on security assistance, like when we try to rebuild Arab militaries and throw billions of dollars at these problems, like Egyptian tanks, like rebuilding the Afghan security forces, like that doesn't work. But when we do work with small elite forces like the Iraqi counterterrorism forces or the Maghawir in Lebanon, like you can make much more progress in just small forces working with US SOF to actually just stabilize situations. And we also do better when we find local legitimate actors on the ground, like say, at the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, like small numbers of Americans supporting actors that can actually be effective on the ground is a much better tool than, billions of dollars worth of arms sales that don't do anything other than really escalate tensions in the region and don't actually have a positive impact. So we can do this both cheaper and better, and Frank, and then finally, the third piece of this just means a sort of more limited US military posture. And we're also doing some work there, again, because we need to be focusing more on other parts of the world, so, that means, I think, as opposed to using carrier strike groups and B-2s to try to deter, for example, Iraqi, Shia militia attacks on American forces, in Iraq, like that's a very expensive tool as opposed to using soft and local training and partners, for example. And even, much of our military posture in the region is based on sort of a, response to Iran or a major conflict with Iran. Or the rationale goes something like this. We need to have the capability to destroy Iran's nuclear program if we needed to, or set it back as much as we could, because we can't actually destroy it altogether, because you can't blow knowledge out of, they have the scientific knowledge. But, I agree with that. We need to have that option because that is a sort of core US national interest. But Iran's going to respond with all these other things like missiles and terror attacks and conventional. And so therefore, like we need to have a massive force presence in the region to be able to respond to all those things. Well, first of all, we can accept more risk and still like win a fight like that without having to have all those forces there initially. And second of all, it's not clear to me that's exactly how Iran responds. I mean, when the US killed Qasem Soleimani, we had a major response, but it wasn't an all-out war, And so why put all of our military posture in the region dependent on this idea that we're going to have a major war with Iran, where that's not a very likely scenario and we can accept a lot more risk. So I'll sort of, stop there just to summarize, like diplomacy based on de-escalation, less military investment, and a focus on sort of soft and working with local partners, and an assistance mix that moves more towards the long-term challenges of the region. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Now we've had two, and I think they're complementary views of how we can, again, reimagine focus on the Middle East with priorities going in different directions. So now let's hear from Michelle.
Thank you, Jim. Well, first of all, let me say that I like very much the work that Rand and CNES, have both done on this subject. And I think there are really valuable points there. I do think this issue of being the United States getting stuck in legacy relationships, which the Rand report points out, not only do they not suit the current moment, but often, as time goes on, they have other problems. They create reputational risks for the United States as things, in the recipient country, the politics and so forth change. That has certainly happened with Egypt, I would say to some extent with Israel as well. And then the United States gets dragged entrapped, into all kinds of things. I mean, for example, supporting the Saudi-led intervention of Yemen. And then, allies, sort of recipients of these legacy relationships, free riding on them. So I think Rand laid that out really well. And I also really appreciate what's in the CNES report about, about how U.S. actions have in many cases actually made worse what's been going on on the ground. I want to point out also there's a new Chatham House report out along these lines, just I think within the last week or so. And one of the things that they focus on is, as the United States has wanted to withdraw from the region, it has been arming its allies with the idea that, oh, well, regional powers will deal with regional conflicts. And well, how's that been working out? Right? As we've talked about, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and so forth. That's been really working out disastrously. And one of the things that's on the table right now that I hope we'll talk about is this very large arms package for the UAE as a result of the Abraham Accords, this idea that the United States will pump even more sophisticated arms, conventional arms, because I think we should be concerned about proliferation of conventional arms as well as nuclear arms in this region, and setting off a new arms race, and frankly, putting very sophisticated equipment into the hands of a country, the UAE, which is a US ally, but whose actions have been very irresponsible, I think, in some cases. We look at Yemen and Libya particularly. So I think that's, something that bears looking at right now. We're seeing a back and forth. The White House said they're going to basically honor President Trump's promise and go through with this sale. And then we're seeing some senators pushing back on that. So those are things to talk about. Now, yes, Carnegie's also coming out with some work on this topic. My colleague Fred Wary and I are putting out a series of essays authored by all different authors related to some specific points on this topic. That'll be coming out in about 3 weeks. One thing that I do want to bring to the table that I don't think has been addressed so far in the other reports that have come out. I mean, the other reports have said quite correctly that heavily securitized US involvement in this region doesn't really serve US interests. It doesn't serve the peace and stability of this region or of the world. The point that I want to bring is the rapidly changing political economy of the region as we look at the looming end of the oil and gas era. This to me is, the mega trend in this region that is really, it has started disrupting things, and it's going to do so much more in the coming decade or two. As we know, the pandemic has in some ways been an accelerator of global trends, and this is one of them. The projections now are that, for example, global demand for gasoline will never return to what it was before the pandemic. Right. So, things are changing now. Of course, people are we're not all stopping using fossil fuels overnight. But what we're looking at is an accelerated move toward obviously a changing world energy mix, and the implications for this region are enormous. I read very closely the International Monetary Fund's reports on this region. They have been just absolutely kind of ringing the alarm bell about what's happening in this region, how it affects the oil exporting and oil importing states a little bit different ways, but it affects every state in the region, and none of them have diversified their economies in the way that they really need to. They've made different progress, and they have different size sovereign wealth funds, et cetera. Every state is a little bit different. But the big picture is there's a lot of trouble coming because they have not built productive economies that can employ their populations. That's the bottom line. So I think we need to look at this factor when we look at how the United States should be engaging with this region. Because unfortunately, we're in a situation now where we and our allies in Europe and around the world are not the ones who are really making a meaningful contribution to helping these countries find their way to the post-oil era, find their way to productive economies and political systems that can support productive economies. We're not doing that. What we're doing is we're pouring in arms. We're arming them while they sort of fight each other to the death. I don't think that's where US strategy should be in this era. And I know it's a big change to make. Now, also, one might say, well, it's not up to the United States to fix their economies, to fix their political systems. We've had it with state building and so forth. I'm not arguing that the United States needs to go in there and reinvent. What I'm saying is the US is going to engage with countries in this region, is going to continue to, in some ways. The question is, what way should it be? How can we make our involvement constructive and leading to a better outcome, a better future for this region and for ourselves and our own interests? And I think we're doing the wrong thing. And just to end on something very provocative, who's the one who's going in there and engaging heavily on tech, on infrastructure, it's China. Much more so than us. I think that's, there's something that's gone wrong here with the United States getting stuck with the role of kind of, arming all the parties in the region and fueling regional wars, and China being the one who's involved in, helping them move their economies into the future. And this is not to praise the role of China. I'm just saying that I think that something basic has gotten broken here. I just want to add one more point, which is that Dahlia and Ilan have both quite rightly talked about, all these, how the United States should take a bit more of an interest in the people of the region and so forth. We have a real problem because there's a gap in almost every country in the region between the state, the governing elite, and the population. And, a lot of what the United States has done in this region has been because it's what the ruling elites have wanted us to do. And therefore, so to say we want to engage with this region in a different way, it is going to create tension in those relationships. I mean, let us hope we will in some cases, find, members of governments and ruling elites and so forth who have a more enlightened view about the future of their countries. And as I said, see the need to build, productive and inclusive economies, as well as, political systems that can support that. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. You also have complimented the other two, although to some degree in a negative way, because you've raised several issues that make us following Dahlia's prescription a bit more difficult, particularly the impact of climate, i.e. less agricultural resources in the region, while less oil sales, further complicating the whole issue of how we deal with the underlying problems, but still very, very helpful. Okay, here's a question. I'm quoting now from the Biden administration's 2021 National Intelligence Threat Summary that just came out. For the Middle East, Iran will present a continuing threat to U.S. and allied interests in the region as it tries to erode U.S. influence, support Shia populations, entrench its influence, and project power in neighboring states. In the Middle East, Moscow is using its involvement to increase its clout, undercut U.S. leadership, present itself as an indispensable mediator, and gain military access rights and economic opportunities. Now, neither of those countries are actually pursuing a let's work with the people and transform it. They're pursuing classic hard power. Over the next 18 months, what should this administration do? Do you disagree with this intelligence assessment? Do you agree with it and think, if we try to do something about it, we're just going to go down the militarization road? Or do you think there is something we can do about it? Not in the next 15 years with an OSCE for the Middle East, but in the next 18 months. So over to you three.
I'm happy to start. I think that well, you just threw in Iran and Russia, so they're different. While they were lumped together, they are quite different issues. When I talk about the vision, long-term OSCE, these are things that are not do not exclude the shorter-term building blocks that Ilan laid out on de-escalation. So I think, for example, the Iran-Saudi dialogue that could potentially be, looks like it's underway, all of these kind of regional de-escalation measures, those are things we can be supporting to lower the temperature in the region. My and the report's view on Iran talks about a two-pronged approach. One is you have to put, as Ilan said, you have the nuclear issue in a box. And the best way to do that is through this multilateral agreement, through diplomacy. But there is a strategy we can be working on now, which gets to the socioeconomic agenda, which gets to the big trend that Michelle laid out, which is the socioeconomic crisis of the region, the shift from oil economies and so forth, and the need to diversify. We can be supporting better functioning societies and governments in the area in which Iran is operating. Because one of the reasons Iran's influence has been so successful is it's very, very good at capitalizing on vacuums and unrest. Because when you have a lot of people with grievances and you are offering an alternative that looks preferable to what their options are at the moment, you're more likely to succeed. So we argue for it falls along the lines of a kind of a containment strategy of the Cold War, but not containment by just deterrence. It's containment by providing a better alternative. So that is, I think, a smarter way to start thinking about chipping away at the Iran problem. On Russia, and for that matter, China, our report and some recent writings I've just done with some colleagues on this issue suggests we do not need to be playing out a Cold War with these great power competitors in the Middle East. I think, Michelle made a good point about, China getting involved in tech and infrastructure, and why are we letting them compete in that space? And we're stuck with the arms sales and all the stuff that's fueling conflict. Our argument is not everything that a country like China is doing in the Middle East is bad news. Certainly, when they're developing smart cities with surveillance technologies that will inflict really serious conditions on people in the region in terms of surveillance and their freedom. That's a bad thing. We should be focused on that. But we don't think everything that China's doing is zero sum. And for that matter, Russia's a little more zero sum, and certainly their intervention in Syria was. But we have areas of overlap with these countries. We both have interest in preventing nuclear proliferation. We have interest in keeping the region stable to prevent the export of extremism. They need a stable infrastructure in terms of supply system and chains, maritime security, especially China still imports 40% of its oil. These are areas of overlap that we think we can leverage better. So we don't think we should get alarmist about these countries' influence in the region, but we do need to be smarter about how we counter it. And that means that we get away from this mindset. And this is a paradigm shift, Jim. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's a paradigm shift saying that fueling the region and channeling more arms sales into this region of high-tech weaponry that's not meeting the moments of what the actual security conditions on the ground are right now in these civil conflicts. That is not the way to compete with either Russia, China, or Iran. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm sure the others have some thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I can throw in a couple of additional ideas just into the mix. And I agree with Dalia on Iran. I think the first step, the Biden administration has talked about, going back into the nuclear agreement and then longer and stronger, right? Like, what does longer and stronger actually mean? What does that better deal actually mean? I think, what longer and stronger means is if you go back into the JCPOA, and again, like my take is, when we wrote about this also at CNAS, you can go back into the JCPOA, or you could do something like a JCPOA minus. Like, the Iranians don't really seem interested in anything other than a return to the JCPOA. So I don't see those other options as very realistic. So I think it's going to come down to JCPOA return or nothing. And I think there's actually like a very reasonable shot. Like, we don't get there. Like, I'm not like, I don't think that what's happening right now in Vienna necessarily is inevitable. There's a lot of very complicated politics on all sides. But let's say you get back in, then yeah, I already mentioned this idea of, a de-escalatory agreement on reducing intervention on all sides in terms of, maybe you take this step here, we'll take this step here. Like, you could even think about it with the Israelis. Like, this is a bit of a stretch, but if the Saudis or the Emiratis do it, maybe you can have a model where the Iranians commit to walking away from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is not high on their list of like super useful organizations, but matters a lot to the Israelis, in exchange for, all right, maybe nothing, nobody will mysteriously get blown up in Iran in the next couple of years. Like, you can try to look for angles like that. You're not, for example, going to get the Iranians to give up on Hezbollah anytime soon. It's absolutely core to their interests. But, every proxy group in the region for Iran has a different level of value. You can look at things like, cooperation between Sudan and Israel and the UAE and maybe Saudi Arabia on security in the Red Sea, which is not an offensive thing, like more like exercises together, more like operations, like just like, freedom of navigation operations. Those aren't provocative, but those could be leveraging the Abraham Accords positively. and also kind of looking at reducing tensions. There's you can encourage this Saudi-Iran dialogue and this UAE-Iran dialogue. I mean, they're going to figure some of this stuff out themselves. Like, our job in that case, if they're interested in doing that, is to encourage it, be constructive, not get too involved, because then they all sort of start posturing for us instead of dealing with themselves and their challenges. But also signal that we want this. I think there's been moments where the US has said like, no, and like, we don't want this. We want to just apply maximum pressure on Iran and not let them talk to each other. Like, I kind of disagree with that. On Russia, the only thing, so I think there's space there, while recognizing like this is a long-term challenge. And then on Iran, I do think, by the way, we're going to, over time, if we make progress in the region, we are going to have to go back for an extension of the JCPOA. Like, there's sunsets that start to run out, 2026 and 2031. 2031 is the most important one. But my argument is, figure something out of the nuclear deal with the short term, then try to make progress in the region. Then it will be easier to go back for an extension of the JCPOA or some follow-on agreement. On Russia, only to add that Russia's game in the Middle East is very much demonstrating its impact, right? Like, it intervened in Syria and kind of won, decisively, or like came inside, it's perceived as being like the decisive intervener that fundamentally changed the game in the most important, massive, like destabilizing civil war in the region. And now everybody looks to the Russians as a player as a result of that. So, how do you counter that? I think it's by demonstrating that the US can still do big, meaningful things in the region, but with a positive agenda, right? And the Abraham Accords, if you leverage it positively, can be a space to do things like that, or some of the other initiatives we're talking about. I think we need to just demonstrate we can still get stuff done, but in a constructive way. And as for the Chinese, just throwing a couple of other ideas out there to build on what Dalia is talking about. One example of an area where we've done some work at CNAS, actually together with some colleagues from RAND, is on this issue of Israel, where Israel is a key technology partner for the United States. The Chinese are investing in Israel, and there's been some tensions with the US. I think aligning US-Israel sort of approaches to technology and investment, looking for alternatives to Chinese investment in Israel, maybe again using the Abraham Accords where the Gulf states can be investing in Israeli technology as a substitute for Chinese investment. There's space there for work too, and that also goes back to Michelle's point of, if you can facilitate economic engagement and partnership amongst our partners in the region towards positive, especially on uses of technology, where like the norms that come with the use of technology is so critical for, and where frankly, a lot of our authoritarian friends in the region are there are allies in the security front, but they're probably more comfortable with the Chinese mode, right? Of like, let's use this technology to spy on our people. But the more we get involved and engaged and positive in that direction, the more we can kind of pull them to our side on that question.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, look, Ilan and Dalia have said a lot of important things here. I won't go on too long, but just to add a couple of points, a return to diplomacy, and particularly multilateral diplomacy and rules-based, norms-based diplomacy, I think is really important. And we're already seeing the positive effects. The Biden administration, for all the talk about, limited bandwidth, and of course they have to focus on what's going on inside the United States, but still they've shown they have quite an appetite for diplomacy, including in this region. And we've seen some positive effects. And I think that, seeing some of these little conflicts within the region getting resolved, or at least ameliorating, the lowering of tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, perhaps some talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a little bit of a rapprochement between Turkey and Egypt, I think we're seeing sort of the ripple effects of like it, and it seems to be it's a good time actually for diplomacy. People are seeing, and some of the conflicts that have been burning very hotly are burning down a bit, so it's a good time for that. And I think, on both of these cases, it's true. I just want to add another word about Russia. Look, I think, I think it's distressing that, Russia kind of gained the position that it did, the military posture that it has in the region now compared to what it used to be, because of building on US and other policy failures, particularly in Syria and Libya. It's not a great situation, but I don't think we should exaggerate it. There are real limits. I mean, I watch carefully some of the relationships, like, for example, the Russian-Egyptian military relationship. There are a lot of tensions in that relationship. There are real limits on what Russia can provide. Russia is not a rich country, and talk about a country that's going to be hard hit by the end of the oil and gas era, right? And by the way, that also applies to Iran. I think there's a lot that the U.S. can do with a positive agenda, a positive diplomatic and economic agenda, engaging with others to create appealing alternatives, and not to exaggerate what some of these other powers can do in the region.
Thanks, Linda.
Yes, I would like to just emphasize that I think the US is still a partner of choice in many ways. And we should be focused on positive forms of competition. I'll be brief here because I have some other points I'd like to make later in response to Elon's points. Thank you.
Let's move to questions from the audience. Okay. Jordan is an important partner in the region. What is the U.S. strategy to maintain or enhance its stability? This is coming from David Biddy. Who wants to tackle that?
I guess I will start. I see no other hands, although I'm tempted to call on you, Marissa. We would love to hear your thoughts, but yeah, Jordan is one of those partners that we need to be quite concerned about. It's one of the few partners in the region that aligns with our interests just almost across the board. But of course, this issue of governance, this issue of all of the socioeconomic pressures we've been talking about and the failure to adjust is plaguing Jordan as well. And I think this recent whatever incident, whatever the causes of this incident, and I have this so-called coup attempt, which is really unclear and murky, and I think none of us really understand it fully yet. But it's clear, one thing we do know is that they have these domestic pressures. They're not going away. It's not just about, the typical divide between the tribal East and the Palestinian population. These are widespread across the society. Jordan is facing incredible economic pressures. The pandemic has hit it incredibly hard. It was already under extreme pressure because of the refugee influx from the civil war in Syria. And this is a good example of why these festering conflicts spill over and create instability that directly harm us because they make our partners incredibly vulnerable. So I think Jordan is one of those cases. The best way we can support them is this rebalance that I started with, which is investing far more in economic, diplomatic, and governance support, and engaging in more support for the refugee population in the country, and finding solutions that are durable there. The military assistance needs to be tailored. Linda may want to speak to this more. She's worked a lot on some of the ideas Alon was talking about and how you tailor military assistance to appropriate needs to fight the real counterterrorism threats that Jordan is facing and continues to face from a potential resurgence of ISIS. So I think all of these things are going to be important, but we would still put Jordan as quite a high priority partner in terms of our own assessment on the region. And the last point I want to make is kind of in response to something Michelle and maybe Alon mentioned as well, which is, having the opportunity at this moment to de-escalate conflicts, because regional players themselves are interested in this. I think it's an important point in the governance question too. Many of these countries have 2030 plans. They have reform plans. They know they need to diversify their economies. They know over 60% of their population is under the age of 30 and they don't have viable jobs. They are educated for jobs that don't exist. Women in particular are facing these pressures. Jordan has all of those things. We're not talking about a strategy that's imposing our will on this region. We're talking about working with partners who themselves recognize the need for reform. And hopefully Jordan can be one of those. It's to be determined, but I think that that's the direction we need to be going in.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
Jim, while you're
Okay.
looking at that, may I add another point to
Sure,
what
go ahead.
Dahlia has said? Look, the pandemic pressed the pause button on protest, but that is already being lifted. And we're seeing protest return to a lot of Arab countries, right? We had this huge wave in 2011, 2012 of uprisings, and another one, let's not forget, in 2019. And there's unfinished business from several of these, including things that happened in 2019. Algeria, I think, has a lot of unfinished business. Lebanon, of course, and also Jordan. So I think, we really need to watch what's going to happen. And of course, the pandemic has increased economic suffering in a lot of countries. And one of the things the pandemic has done around the world is to highlight economic disparities. Everywhere in our own country, but also in the Middle East, that I think people have seen very clearly the vulnerability of people who are living in the informal economies, for example, compared to the elites who, did well even through the pandemic and so forth. We are going to see more unrest in these countries. We are going to see protests. We're going to see uprisings. To me, it's not a question of if, it's just a question of where and when. In the earlier waves, we saw much less activity in the monarchies, in the countries that had monarchies, as opposed to the republics, although that wasn't entirely true. Let's not forget about Bahrain. But I think that could begin to change. And I do think, Jordan is quite vulnerable here. And this episode that we saw, a couple of weeks ago could have had, some relationship to that, to, people within the state feeling vulnerable as public protests started to reemerge in Jordan.
Jim, if I may jump in and follow up on those 2 points by Dahlia and Michelle, and also sort of ask a question. So I agree with both of you with regards to Jordan and the pressures from within. And I also agree that reform has to be an organic process that the US would support through more economic assistance. Jordan, as an example, is a top recipient of USAID funding. And a lot of these programs go to government and civil society, to peace and security projects. A lot of the economic projects are also framed within the security lens. But we also see dependencies being created due to the cycle of how this development aid forms. And organic reform has not sort of picked up by itself without some form of a nudge or some form of pressure. And that's not solely the case in Jordan. It's sort of more of a trend across the region. So how do you...
Marissa, we lost you.
I can maybe hop. I mean, I think I knew where the question was going, and I wanted to hop in on some of this. Anyway, although Marissa is back, I don't know if there's more she wanted to add, but I think, how can we be constructive given that, we're doing some work on this at CNAS and some of our follow-up reports, and something we're going to be releasing in a couple months that dives deeper, particularly on this issue of aid and a couple of the different conclusions. One is, much of our assistance in the region, even our ESF or even our like economic and USAID assistance, it still goes from the frame of first and foremost, like building bilateral relationships with the leadership, as opposed to actually taking that money and focusing it on programs that actually work. So I think one thing we can do is like that requires a shift of mentality to the problem is a human economic development and human opportunity. Like we need to at least make sure our programs are contributing to that, while recognizing that in some ways it's a drop in the bucket. Like, and at the end of the day, like we can't by ourselves. We can also encourage our partners and allies and other outside donors, but really like some of these things will have to take place from within. But the other thing I think, and it goes back also to our points about de-escalation, diplomacy, trying to reduce the infighting in the region. In many of these instances, when you've gotten to that point of like healthy protest and the types of and pushes for reform, that's when all the external actors come swooping in and kill it or make it even worse and dramatically exacerbate the problem, right? This is where intervention sort of can turn these small protests into massive proxy wars that are just so damaging for everyone. So you can't fully stop that, but our policies should be geared towards containing that. And going to Michelle's point, about the moments, sort of the increasing diplomacy in the region during the early Biden administration, I think for these governments, just the fact that they know that things like engaging and not escalating will be viewed as a positive in Washington and give them more, entree into Washington and view them to be viewed more credibly in Washington is like a positive. So you look, for example, at Saudi Iran or the Saudi Qatar thing. In both of those cases, I think at least it's not the driver. The driver isn't like, what does Washington think? But it matters, right? And actually one of the things about even the Abraham Accords or the normalization agreements was it was viewed by the UAE as something that could both help the Trump administration and be sold by the Trump administration, but would also be viewed positively by an incoming Biden administration, especially since it involved, putting a pause on at least formal annexation of the West Bank. So the point being, we aren't the drivers, but we can do these types of things, both on the assistance side, and on the diplomacy side. Maybe like one other short point, which is we also can think about rethinking, so much of our assistance right now in the Middle East, and we don't necessarily do this in other regions, is bucketed into like, here's the money this country's going to get, here's the money that country's going to get, as opposed to here's a broad fund for effort in the region based on like the most compelling projects, the most promising situations, putting more into, putting $1.3 billion a year into, like high-end weapons for like an unclear conflict, like for what we're doing in Egypt, and putting like a drop in the bucket into Tunisia, which, has many challenges, but is more promising than so many others, is like one way to just shift the overall, as just one example. So, it's not a panacea, but I think there's more we can do in that space.
I just, if I can, Linda spent a lot of time thinking about assistance in our project, so I want to turn the floor to her. But just to quickly pick up on your last point, Alon, we very much talk about that in our report, the need to diversify our partnerships as well, not just the aid, but reward best practices and incentivize best practices. So when you have Gulf Arab partners like Kuwait or Oman, who are very important mediators in de-escalating some of these conflicts in that subregion, let's showcase that. Let's create centers of excellence for de-escalation and put them in those places. And let's focus on countries like Tunisia that are still, struggling, but still moving toward hopefully solidify their democratic transition. Let's think about countries like Jordan and the type of aid we're giving there, but we have had too much of a concentration. I think the bottom line in all of this is too much of a concentration in too few of countries in heavily weighted toward military assistance. So the overall takeaway is, spread things around more, focus on programs and countries who are executing best practices. And even with the military and economic assistance that we do give, we need to reform how it's given and the kind of programs we're supporting. So Linda, I know you have ideas on that, especially on our economic assistance and development assistance.
Yes, I'd like to address actually both the development, economic assistance and security assistance in this set of comments, because we look at, I think it's very important, and Elon, you mentioned, ESF is really often just used to direct budget support, and it doesn't go in any way to the kinds of outcomes that policy should be striving to. And what we do is we look at both tools for selectivity, who's going to receive the assistance, and conditionality, so that there are an agreed pathway to the outcomes that are sought, and an explicit arrangement that if those pathways are not being pursued, the aid does not continue. And that's really, I think Millennium Challenge Corporation is a very interesting program, in that there's literally a contract reached with the country. There's a clear set of expectations, and there is assessment, monitoring, and evaluation built into the program. I have done many assessment projects, and often the data isn't even gathered, so it's impossible to do rigorous assessment. And I think these basic principles need to become enshrined. And Congress has tried in the Global Fragility Act and in many sources of security assistance, they have tried to enforce this. But the problem is, having authored many of these assessments, is often the executive branch does not take those assessments and then apply them to adapting or terminating the program. And I think it's critically important that across the board, we start being very deliberate about use of assistance. And if you don't mind, I'd like to talk briefly about, I have a different view, having spent, as you know, 20 years on the use of SOF. And I don't think it is wise to hold them up as the only foothold in the region for our security interests. And our program does not, our report does not say end security assistance. And I think it's, I testified before Congress last month, the consequence of leaving SOF as the permanent presence around the world to guard against terrorism threat resurgence is burning out the force, and with very significant deleterious effects. It's also an astrategic use of SOF and of the military. Mowing the grass is a temporary panacea. And what we need to do is, as I've said, selectively and with conditionality build partners, but I wouldn't say just CT forces. And those very same techniques can be used to develop valid police forces. You need civilian governance, you need ministerial governments. It can't be just free-floating CT forces, because that's a recipe for disaster. I've spent, since 2003, I watched the CTS grow up in Iraq. And what is critical is they had intensive mentoring, that it was a long-term approach. They focused on leader development, and they were able to sidestep what happened to the rest of the Iraqi army, was interfering with the chain of command and supplanting highly sectarian leaders, which, as you know, Elon, caused a lot of the collapse in the Maliki era. So I think we know some lessons, but we need to start applying them. And I would point out that finally, on diplomacy, Iraq is a strategic partner. Whether or not we can really wrap our heads around that after 20 years of characterizing it, it's going to be a linchpin of stability in the region. And witness, it was actually Mustafa al-Kadhimi that brought together Saudi Arabia and Iran for the talks. We have restarted the strategic dialogue. Ambassador Jim Jeffrey's successor, Matt Tuller, is there doing a great job in Iraq. And I think if we can work with partners, we can find a way that they will be true stability forces. And that doesn't mean being completely expedient in our approach to them, but where we have partners that can deliver, we need to stick with it and stick with it in the right way. Thank you.
Jim, can I just respond really quickly to Linda, only to say that
Sure.
I fundamentally agree with everything she just went through, especially on the security assistance stuff. And we've written some similar things at CNAS, and especially, on the points on SOF and the need to do things like policing and also M&E, right? Like monitoring and evaluation of security assistance, which doesn't get nearly the same level of attention as aid. So only to say, yes, I totally agree. In some ways, throwing out SOF out there on my end was a shorthand for, you need forces, and what you need is a lot of effort on numerous different kinds of forces that ultimately like train the capability to do this, like both counterterrorism, but also the policing and the internal security and the things, but also, I mean, one of the challenges there, just to also point out, is trying to get them up to standards that then don't have them violating democratic norms and working against everything else you're trying to do. And there's a balancing act there that we're not always going to hit perfectly, and that can be a problem. And frankly, I'm not sure there's a way around that. There are ways around it. There are ways to do it as best as possible. But by holding, using things like the Leahy Law and other just elements of our policy, but to some extent, there are some trade-offs there. And if you look at it at a narrow US national interest perspective, sometimes you got to yes, you have to balance between those two.
Thank you, Ian. We have a question from Amit Pandya. The longest lived irritant to stability in the region is Israel-Palestine. In this perspective, do the Abraham Accords set things back? How can the US leverage them for positive change? We've talked a bit about the Abraham Accords in this context, but does anybody want to take that on?
Maybe I can jump in here, Jim. Look, I mean, I think if we're talking about Israel-Palestine, the Abraham Accords are a separate conversation, right? They do, there may be benefits from those accords. I do think that the Trump administration was a bit careless in terms of the prices that they paid for some of those individual accords, whether it was the arms deal for the UAE or changing position on the Western Sahara and so forth. I mean, that they did things sort of a bit heedlessly that I think, I think the Biden administration maybe would like there to be more such normalization agreements between Arab states and Israel. I think they'll be a little bit more careful about what are the repercussions of these deals. But on the Israel-Palestine issue, I want to say, some colleagues of mine at Carnegie put out a report yesterday called, Breaking the Status Quo. And it really proposes a different approach. I mean, what it says is that U.S. policy to date has basically incentivized very negative behavior on the part of both Israelis and Palestinians. That's leading us to a really bad situation. And it proposes taking a different approach. Doesn't propose that the U.S. necessarily does more, but rather does different. And the approach that's laid out in that report is what's called a rights-based approach, where the United States would really focus not on doing anything and everything to have a peace process or to get back to negotiations at all costs, as we have been doing, but just to and not to take a position at this point on what the shape of a solution has to be. We all know that the two-state solution that was supported internationally for so long has been greatly undermined, the possibility of that taking place. So this would be instead the United States saying, well, whatever the solution that emerges is going to be, the United States will only support a solution that guarantees the rights and the security of all the people living between, the Mediterranean and the Jordan. So it's a different approach, and it would accord much more with kind of the Biden administration's putting human rights back in the middle of its foreign policy, returning to an emphasis on a rules-based order and international law and so forth. So anyway, I just urge people to take a look at that report.
Thank you very much. I'll return to the question of mode for a second, because we have so much unanimity here. I want to introduce a bit of strife and conflict into this discussion before we all go away. The general consensus is everything we've done in the Middle East has basically been wrong. And certainly I started off by listing all of those things. And while I'm not quite sure whether this is a indicative and inevitable result of bad long-term policies or a whole bunch of really stupid decisions based upon a whole set of actors who didn't understand the Middle East. That's still up for grabs, but you've got a large inventory of blunders that we've made there. There's no doubt about it. But here's my problem, and it starts with diplomacy, because that word has been bandied around a bit. It can be used in several different ways. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Jim Baker, and Madeleine Albright all use diplomacy very, very effectively, but in a realpolitik kind of way. In a quid pro quo, you agree to a compromise with us, so we're going to continue to pressure you. Another kind of diplomacy, and it's been the primary one we've been discussing today, is essentially we've got misunderstandings, we've got lack of trust, we've got unwillingness to work together for common goals. Let's kind of up the diplomacy, move away from military, and find common grounds. Here's the problem, folks. Let's shift away from the Middle East. That's exactly the approach we took for 30 years in East Asia and in Europe after 1989. As we're talking today, we have over 100,000 Russian troops arrayed on the Ukrainian border, and we have very, very serious discussions about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Either of these events would be an absolute game changer for the international situation that we haven't seen since the 1930s. This isn't the Soviets in Afghanistan. It isn't, Chinese Indian sniping at 15,000 feet. These are big, big things, Taiwan and Ukraine. So my question is, again, going back to the Biden administration intelligence threat summary that was just out, they're painting Iran and Russia in the region as not simply an actor among other actors in a conflict, say Greece and Turkey and Cyprus, or India and Pakistan in Kashmir, but rather as countries that are exploiting and generating conflict and chaos. I agree that Iran, for example, in the region has played off of the conflicts and the crisis and the instability that we saw in Yemen and Syria and in Iraq after the American invasion of Iraq, after the Arab Spring and such. But folks, daily for the last 2 years, I saw Iran doing everything it could to increase that instability, to make those countries suffer so that they can only depend on Iran. Good example, the difficulties Iraq has in exploiting its tremendous natural gas. They flare more natural gas than they actually consume. Why? Because Iran has a chokehold on gas exports to Iraq, and it has the abilities, legal and illegal, to block the various efforts to try to get the international oil sector to come in and help them. Same thing in Lebanon. Every effort by us, by the French, by the EU, to try to help that country out of its crisis over the last year has been blocked largely by Hezbollah carrying out an Iranian agenda. Better and the best example, of course, is Syria. Better a hulk of a state with half the population gone, with the cities in ruins, as long as our guy is in charge and we can do with what we want there, than some kind of compromise solution, which, believe me, both the Obama and Trump administrations offered the Russians many times, that will resolve the thing. That's the problem we have. I'm not hearing a good answer to that. That's why I said in the next 18 months.
Jim, maybe I'll try initially with the response. Look, I mean, I think you need kind of a balancing act in how you deal with these challenges. Like, you could look, for example, at Asia or Europe, and you could say, well, like, we have serious tensions now with China, we have serious tensions now with Russia, and so our policy for the last 30 years has been a disaster, like a mistake, right? On the other hand, like, you look at, the economic situation in Asia, you look at like where things have gone in Europe, you look at the EU, yes, there are many challenges. And now, you could argue that the US took, in some cases, especially in the last few years, naive approach to China in some cases. But like those regions are doing so much better than the Middle East in so many ways, even with those challenges, compared to like how the Middle East is doing for a number of different reasons, right? Which is not all us, but like ours, you know, policy hasn't necessarily made anything better in the Middle East either. And so I think some of the things that we're proposing here could actually significantly improve the situation. You don't have to go all the way, you know, just part of the way, right? And the only other thing I'll say about this is like, when you're gonna play sort of hard-nosed realpolitik diplomacy, which, you know, we do need to in instances, you also have to have core interests and be willing to put serious skin in the game, like to back it up. And like, we don't have those interests in the Middle East anymore the way we did like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? Especially in the 70s and 80s, right? When it was seen as, you know, sort of a place for potential escalation with the Soviet Union all the way up to nuclear war, right? I mean, we just don't have that in the Middle East. Like Iran is not 10 feet tall, right? Even Russia is not like the Soviet Union, right? I mean, these are different countries in a different situation. So it's this combination, I think. So, you know, I mean, I will just say the proposals that we're putting on the table, I don't think any of us think that overnight, magically, like all these things are going to happen. I mean, this is like, we're talking about turning a ship that's been going in like one direction for a generation. You know, that's going to take a long time. And frankly, if you tried to magically do it in a day, it would just infuriate a lot of your partners and allies and destroy a whole bunch of your relationships in ways you don't want to. So you got to slowly turn this ship around. So, but maybe like just continuing to do what we've been doing doesn't work. And so we can slowly start to move in some other ways. That would be kind of my response here. I think we've kind of outlined almost two ideal types for what the policy could be, when probably the reality is we need to move a little bit more towards the middle.
Alan has made my point better than I actually made it, as follows. In Europe and in East Asia, exactly what we haven't managed to do, although we've known it's been a problem for a long, long time, we have created a stable, economically robust region, or we haven't, the people of the region did it, but they did it with a great deal of help from us. Our trade policy since World War II, our monetary policy since World War II, and in the case of Japan, Korea, and Western Europe, massive aid programs for the first 20 years after World War II. Thus, we have created stable, economically flourishing regions, exactly what we want in the Middle East, yet we face dramatic threats to security by Russia and China in those regions. The conclusion I draw is that working for stability and economic growth is a very good thing in and of itself. It is a worthy cause, and it can contribute to security, because at the end of the day, we've yet to see an invasion of either the Ukraine or Taiwan. That story is yet to be written, but we're facing a very serious threat of that, which means that simply tweaking, fixing, going under the hood and making these societies better does not mean that you escape from geopolitical threats. And geopolitical threats, and there I would disagree also a bit with Ilan, the Middle East isn't as important as it used to be. It's still pretty important. We may be pivoting or believe we're pivoting out of the region, but boy, China and Russia are pivoting in a big way. They think it's important. And if they think it's important, it's probably pretty important.
Jim, if I can add something here. Look, I mean, nothing is going to return the unipolar world, and nothing is going to, return the Pax Americana, to this region, right? I mean, the things you're talking about with Ukraine and Taiwan, a lot of it, has to do with the rise of other powers relative to the United States. That was a certain moment, and it was one in which sort of we all grew up and so forth, and sort of viewed it as the norm, but it isn't the norm historically. So that's one point. The other thing is, you can't beat something with nothing. And I think what all of us are arguing about is for the United States, and I would argue with our other allies, particularly our democratic allies in Europe, in Asia, to be, offering some sort of a positive alternative. One of the things I think that we haven't done so far at any point is to try to create an incentive structure or an enabling international environment to support the development of productive economies and functioning, governments in this region. That has not been our focus. And when we have done it, we've done it, for a very short time, and we haven't been serious about it. That certainly wasn't the case in our engagement with Europe and also with Asia. I think we were far more serious about those things, and it's time to get serious about them relating to the Middle East. And by the way, I think this is going to be, that sort of engagement will be far less costly in human as well as financial terms than the sort of engagement we've had up till now. And I just want to say that we and our democratic allies, particularly our European allies, what are we doing in the Middle East? We're competing for arms sales. That's, probably one of the most meaningful kind of interplay. I certainly couldn't call it coordination regarding the Middle East.
Yeah, but once again, we were successful in creating stable, economically resilient, and by and large, democratic societies all throughout Europe and all throughout East Asia. And boy, we're now faced with the possibility of major war that we haven't seen since the 1940s in both areas. My conclusion is the absolute assumption that you fix security problems in regions by dealing with the underlying socioeconomic and governance problems is not necessarily the whole answer. It certainly is part of the answer. As I said, we haven't seen an invasion of Taiwan. We haven't seen an invasion of Ukraine. If we don't see it, it's going to be partially because we have a set of resilient, stable allies who we can work with to block that. But that still doesn't eliminate the threat and the need to take actions, which include military actions, to deal with it.
Jim, can I just weigh in? I think that last point is so important, that the way to withstand these kind of geostrategic and military threats, which of course will always be there. There's going to be one strategy or one solution that's going to bring world peace. Nobody's that naive, and we're certainly not suggesting it. But that would be a good problem to have in the Middle East, right? If we could get the countries in this region to be as resilient as our democratic partners in Asia and Europe, good problem to have. I'd rather face the threats we have from in Iran, and who knows where Iran will be in the future. But I'd rather face those military threats with partners like that than the partners we have now, which are dysfunctional, which are not delivering to their people, which are only fostering more conflict and instability that has global reach. We've been trying this for decades now, over 40 years. We have not tried the Marshall Plan in the Middle East. We have not tried the kind of economic development that we engaged in Europe. And by the way, with Europe and Asia, we never gave up the military option. I think we have a pretty robust deterrence posture in both regions, right? As far as I know, NATO's still there. Our force presence is still there. I know that's under debate. And we're still facing these problems. So I think, these are not either or. Right? We're saying there's been a lot of one thing done in this region, and it's time to try something else. It doesn't mean throwing everything out the window. It's not happening overnight. But the definition of insanity, do the same thing over and over and expect different results, is the definition of US policy in the Middle East. And it's time to change. I think that's the point we're making.
Thank you, Dahlia. I couldn't be happier. You just underlined the point I've been trying to make for the last hour and a half, and it finally came from you, and that is, of course, you don't give up your military in deterrent role. You may change it, you may modify it, you may reduce it, but it has to be an important component of our overall policies, particularly in the short term. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, of course, but I don't think we have that problem in the Middle East.
Right, I think
no, we don't. We have the problem of unstable, destabilized partners. That's true.
I mean, just to echo one point from Dahlia and Michelle, which is, our strategy for the last 75 years, in Europe and in Asia has been both hard power and the power of, the American model and everything we've exported, economic, political, that's what's worked. And in the Middle East, I see the hard power, but I don't see any of the other piece. And so I think in many cases we're saying you need both. And frankly, I'd rather be the US than China or Russia right now in this great power competition. And part of that is precisely because of everything we've done. And oh, by the way, we've also put billions of people out of poverty, not us, but the entire model and the way we've done things. Like humanity as a whole is also better off for this. So like, why not apply that same mentality to the Middle East?
That sounds great. Okay, are we out of time, Marissa, or?
We have a minute for final thoughts.
Oh, I've already hammered my final thoughts several times in the last 10 minutes. So why don't we turn it over to our three participating speakers? Four, counting Linda. Linda, go first.
Thank you. I just would like to say, I think, Jim, you injected the right tonic here. And I think the point is diplomacy is not inherently soft-headed. And I think you look at the balance of, for example, let's take what has happened recently with regard to Saudi Arabia. The administration has said, no, we're not going to support offensive action. We do accept your legitimate defensive needs. And we're going to put a seasoned envoy on the negotiation track. I think similarly, Libya needs that kind of attention. So it's a balanced mix of diplomacy and the right types of security support for legitimate security needs. And I think you could go around all of these many conflicts, whether they're proxy wars or the external threats, and come at it in that kind of balanced way. And that's really what we're trying to recommend, so that we don't just fall into the threatism trap and say, now we've got a new threat, it's Russia. Now we've got a new threat, it's Iran, and try to get off of this wheel. And I think actually the intelligence report is pretty balanced and it says, for example, the main terrorist threat is inspired threat. So let's not overblow the threats and let's go at it in a balanced way.
So my 2 cents,
Go ahead,
very
Dahlia.
okay, very quickly, if we're going in this order, I'm just going in the order of the boxes. So is that we need a paradigm shift. It is too long of the same kind of policy investments in this region, these security military investments, these very short-term considerations. And it's time to focus on a different model. So it is these adjustments and balancing, but it's really rethinking how we do business in this region at a more fundamental level, who we do business with and how we do it. And I think what we really need to start moving away from is this idea that geostrategic and interest are opposed to socioeconomic and governance challenges. They are critical. You need to get better governance. You need to build better functioning societies, deal with these economic, socioeconomic grievances, education, employment, because you will not get stability. You will not get strategic gains. You will not have good partners if we don't get there. So I think we need to get rid of this either or framing, and that requires really a new way, a new mindset, a new way of thinking about this region, thinking about people, not just leaders, thinking about a vision of what outcomes we want to try to get to. We have that with Europe and Asia. I'm really glad you raised that, Jim. We don't have that with the Middle East. That's exactly what we need today.
I'll just say, oh, sorry, Michelle. I'll just say thank you for having me and spoken enough. This is great.
Thanks. I also want to thank everyone for inviting me to this conversation. I want to add one last note of caution or concern about Biden administration policies. They have a high priority on getting back into the JCPOA with Iran. They're very focused on the Iran threat, and that is very important. What I hope they won't do is overpay for it. And I don't even mean regarding Iran. I saw, I think the Obama administration overpaid in some ways for the deal with Iran. Like, for example, going along with supporting the Saudi intervention in Yemen, I thought was a terrible mistake. you know, that has had horrific repercussions for Yemen. That problem could have been solved with diplomacy at that time. And you know, the Trump administration in some ways, I think, overpaid for the Abraham Accords in ways that could cause problems, like kicking off a new regional arms race, et cetera. I hope the Biden administration will be wiser than that and see that it can get, you know, back into an agreement with Iran without paying off other powers in the region in ways that can ultimately be quite damaging.
Marissa, wrap it up.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks to all our expert panelists for kicking off this discussion. I hope we, as Linda mentioned in her introduction, I hope we have many more of such discussions and perhaps engage the people from the region to actually comment and assess those reports that have come out of the three think tanks represented today, to see what is actually resonating and do they believe that this type of approach works, and how perhaps we'll hear more ideas as to how to go about it. So thank you once again, and we look forward to more discussions in the future.